I'll tell you, every speaker here today has created a new presentation just for today. They realize that, you guys have heard all the future stuff. You go to all these events. They're going to bring you real world stuff that you can start using tomorrow. Please make this interactive. Please ask questions and have fun today. And with that, I'm going to give you Chris Colotti. I know he personally was working on this during his vacation. And,
no, actually, I wasn't.
Oh, dude, you're killing me.
I did it when I got back.
All right. So this is a slide deck that no one's seen before.
Including me.
Including Chris. And have a good time.
All right, so sorry, I got to get, I'm like double mic'd here for the video. Good for the video? All right. So I'm actually leashed here, so this will be interesting. So yeah, as Chris said, this is a presentation that I kind of put together specifically out of some conversations with a customer a couple weeks ago and some stuff that's sort of been on my mind. So some of it's, I call it a scattered look at service offerings because this was literally done from some whiteboard stuff that I was working on in my office and really just a lot of ideas from customer conversations around how do we deal with service offerings, what's an SLA. So we're going to cover a lot of these ideas that I have. So one of the things I want to point out, so for those that don't know me, first of all, so Chris Colotti, consulting architect for VMware. I've actually been in the Global Center of Excellence now for about 2 years. I spend most of my time writing IP documentation like the vCloud Reference Architecture Toolkit. There's a group of us actually working on that, it's not just me. White papers, there's a new white paper coming out that some of these slides are actually based on in a VMware presentation as well. And I do some customer engagements, I do some customer meetings, not as many as I used to. It's my blog site and you can find me on Twitter. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to take I'm going to take you through a little bit about what I think makes up a service level, right? So there's some caveats in the first slide that although this is on a VMware slide deck, which I probably shouldn't have done, this isn't like best practice. This is just me talking to you guys about what I think about some of these things. Having been an ex-customer and an ex-administrator, I thought it would be just an interesting dialogue because I get these questions all the time and I don't want to answer them always as a VMware best practice person, right? I want to talk about some things that we've seen in the field. We'll take a little bit through allocation models and a deep dive approach. This is based on the white paper that's coming out by Frank Denneman and myself and the VMworld presentation. And then we'll talk about some use cases and designing your catalogs. So some questions I always get is things like this. So what defines a service level? Well, if you ask anybody who works at VMware, the answer is always, thank you. That says the VMware guys in the back, right? It's one of those things where it's multi-dimensional, right? I always get that question. I say, well, how do I write my SLA? It's like, well, what do you want to be in the SLA? And they say, well, I don't know, right? But I got to have an SLA, but I don't know what to put in it. But I got to have an SLA, right? So there's this constant back and forth. All of these precious metals that we always talk about, I hate these things. We always talk about this with cloud. We always say bronze, silver, gold, platinum, whatever. So I'm going to take you through a conversation I had with a customer around sort of what I call melting these metals, right? How do we break these things down? And is availability actually a service? I get this question all the time. Is availability considered part of the service level? Maybe, maybe not. I've got some thoughts on that. And how are these things, kind of paired together and what have we seen in the field? So this is a key right here. This is not official guidelines. This is me and my crazy brain for 2 weeks sitting in my office trying to come up with something interesting to talk about because Chris told me not to use the same old stuff. So if you don't like what I talk about, you can yell at Harney because he made me do it. So what is a service level agreement? So I actually went out to the Google and I asked, what is a service level agreement? Because I was kind of curious how this thing's defined myself. And this is one of the definitions. So it's basically written around delivery time of the service or performance, and I kind of highlighted the word or specifically because I found that interesting. And it's around mean time between failures, so it does define it as availability, disaster recovery, and also repair, which is also availability. So the interesting part is, where's the and performance? So how many people think that when you get a service level that there's a written definition around a guarantee of performance? You would think, right? But in most cases, from customers I've talked to, there isn't always a guarantee of performance. There's guarantees in other areas, but performance is something that is measured differently, right? So most times it's things like, can you support a disaster? Is my stuff backed up? Those are the kind of things that are in a service level. Performance is a tricky thing. I had this conversation internally yesterday around an internal beta, and I basically told them, do not talk about performance, only because it's about an evaluation program, right? So then you think, oh, if I'm evaluing something, am I evaluing it for function and feature, or am I actually doing a proof of concept where I want to prove performance? Two different things, right, in my mind. So these are some of the metrics, right? So we always look at transactions per second, what are the average response times? It's very hard to define. So if somebody puts that in an SLA, how do they measure it? And then how do you, the customer or the consumer of the cloud or whatever you're using, actually say you're not getting it, right? Is it, I clicked on the website and it didn't come up in 2 seconds, it came up in 5 seconds, right? How many of us as administrators heard that from our web teams over the years? Right? I remember those. Those were always fun. So there's this concept that I have of separating the service level agreement from the level of service, right? So what's in the agreement versus what you're actually getting. And this really is something that I've kind of discovered is multi-dimensional. It's not a flat piece of paper. There's a lot to it. It's one of these things as we walk through this, you'll see there's different pieces that make this thing up. So it's kind of a cube, if you will. So another set of definitions that I found on the Wikipedia, we don't have to go through all these. You can actually see these if you go out there, but they talk about customer-based, service-based, multi-level, but all of them talk about sort of the same thing. They're all around what is in the agreement and what the person is getting. So how does this stuff actually relate to a cloud that you guys might offer as a provider, right? So I always look at it from the provider and the consumer side. So providers are the people who are giving the service, and consumers are the ones who are actually signing a contract for the service level agreement. So I get this all the time. These metals don't make sense to me. Why do we call it gold? Why do we call it silver? Why do we call it bronze? I don't know. Because somebody 3 years ago or 2 years ago when we developed vCloud Director said, this is going to be a cool slide. And I don't necessarily agree with it. So this is how I like to break these things down. And I actually had this conversation with the same customer the other day. And I said, well, what if we looked at these levels differently? What if we said, well, platinum is something more like broken down by hardware, meaning our platinum service is something along the lines of this. It's maybe solid state storage, it's big iron boxes, it's providing support and infrastructure for monster VMs, right? Large VMs specifically. And I'll get into this in a minute as to why and why we might want to break this down. And maybe our gold tier is something a little bit lower. It's maybe fiber channel storage, it's smaller hosts, smaller clusters, less total memory, right? So maybe that platinum tier is, when I say big iron, large boxes with large memory, and I'm still thinking, the larger than 256 gigs of RAM. And then maybe in this tier, we're mixing our allocation models. Maybe we have VMs that are no larger than 24 gigs of RAM. So we're setting parameters, right, in these tiers of service, in this hardware to say, in this provider, in this, from a vCloud Director perspective, in this provider, we're not going to allow anything bigger than 24 gig VMs and maybe 4 CPUs. So we can separate this for maybe some performance. And then as we go down the tiers, it gets smaller and smaller, right? The configuration of the provider changes. So, and this is all the providers back-ending vCloud Director. So when you get down to the bottom, right, the bronze tier is really cheap storage, low memory, pay-as-you-go model specifically. It's transient, fast provisioning is enabled, right? It's your traditional, what I would say your traditional public cloud offering, which is, I need it fast, I need it cheap, and I need it like now, right? And I don't want to pay a lot of money for it. I got to do some testing. I got to throw a new piece of software up really quickly, and that's all I need it for. So keep this in mind, right? So this is how I sort of look at these tiers. The first level of service is I look at is the hardware, right? That's the provider. Because when we build, so you have to step through this in your mind, excuse me, is as we're building vCloud Director, we always start with the provider, right? The provider VDC in vCloud Director is the first step in building the cloud out. So if you don't set that level of service first and then carve that up specifically as you go along, how do you continue providing that service level to the consumer as it goes out? So you have to start from the top down. So this being the first layer of the onion, if you will. So, okay, I've got my providers, and let's say I've got a bunch of vBlocks that I bought, so there's a plug for the vBlock folks in the room. Or I've got some UCS chassis specifically and some NetApp storage, but I've carved it up, right? I've got my provider VDCs broken up, and I know that this tier of service is only going to support this size VMs and et cetera, et cetera. So now I get all my consumers, the people are beating down the door. I've marketed this thing to the day's end, and now they say, I want to use your services. Well, now I've got to determine how to carve this stuff up with these wonderful allocation models. And I think, how many folks were in January when I did that presentation at Gillette? Most? Some? Okay, so I talked about these really high level, and what I wanted to do is relate these back to why it's important to understand the hardware tiers. So real quick, this is sort of the review of the three types of allocation models. And one thing we get all the time is, which one's the best one? So as the provider, talking to a consumer, which allocation model do I pick? How do I know which one is the best allocation model? And there's no right answer. It comes down to how that consumer's functional requirements come to you and what they're going to do with those resources. And this is key to defining a service level. So we've got service providers, and I'm sure I'll hear from Justino afterwards, but they go through these allocation models and they pick one. And they say, this is the allocation model we're going to offer, and this is the configuration of it, and everybody's going to get the same thing. Now, that to me, when I was back as a little youngin', there was a game called Lemmings. Anybody remember that? Right? So what is that? That's just everybody just walking off the cliff together, right? That's all it's about. So if I'm a service provider and I only provide one of these allocation models with the exact same configuration, that's really easy from an SLA perspective, but does it meet those customer requirements? Right? We're all different in this room, and we're going to have different applications that need different requirements and need different performance. And this is what drove the white paper that Frank and I wrote, because we got really frustrated with people not mixing allocation models and not using more than one allocation model and not configuring different settings in each allocation model. So any one of these could be considered the best in that customer's eyes, depending on what they're going to do with it. So the difference being is this particular one, anybody know the default and I think I have the default settings, but anybody want to know the default settings of vCloud Director for pay-as-you-go? For memory reservation specifically? 100. It's 100%. So what does that mean? That means that every virtual machine in that customer's organization gets 100% of physical resources reserved. That, to me, is probably the best performing because they're not sharing anything. Now, the difference is that's going to lower as a provider, that's going to lower my overall consolidation ratio, right? Because when I start applying 100% reservations on everything, and I don't change that default, I start to get very few VMs on my provider cluster. But they're very good performing VMs. But if the customer doesn't need that performance, why am I setting it 100% for that customer? Why am I not setting it at 50 or 0, increasing my consolidation ratio? But I don't want to do what another customer did, which is set everything at 0%, because then what happens? You over-rotate, right? You go the other direction and you consolidate to the point where nobody is getting the performance that they need because everybody ends up sharing eventually, right? The cluster caps out. Reservation pool is basically taking a bucket of resources, right? Saying, well, okay, I can't tell you, I'm going to pick on Justino again. Justino, I can't tell you the resources that I need, but I know I'm going to need about this much, and I'm going to put a bunch of stuff in it, but I want to actually figure it out as I go. And he comes back to me and says, I can do that, right? What I can do is I can create you a reservation pool model. I'll give you 50 gigs of RAM. I'll give you X amount of CPU. Do with it what you want. When you hit the ceiling, come back to me. I'll give you more if you need it. If you don't use all of it, I can reduce it, and I can reduce your bill every month. So it gives me the control. So me being me, those of you who know me, I'm kind of a little bit, tiny bit control freak, just a little. No. So this is the kind of model that I would consider to be premium. I'd pay extra for this model because it gives me, the user, the control of all of my resources within my pool. I'm not restricted by what the provider's telling me, like pay-as-you-go, or even allocation pool. We'll talk about that one in a second. So this is a little bit out of the white paper, but I wanted to show this graphical representation of the three pools because I think it's important to understand where these things get set. So these are the defaults, right? 100% default, 0.26, that should actually be gigahertz, I apologize, so that's actually 260 megahertz. And 0% CPU. So when you build this allocation model, if you're somebody standing up a POC, these are the defaults. You go on, you click, 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 great, I'm done. Well, what happens is as everything gets deployed, all of these settings are applied at the individual virtual machine. So that means every virtual machine gets these reservation settings at the per virtual machine level. Yeah, everybody's going, oh shit. Sorry, it's recorded, I probably shouldn't swear. But it's alarming, right? Because those of us who know vSphere and vSphere resource scheduling really well, we know what that means. That means that this virtual machine, when it gets powered on, it's going to grab all of its memory reservations. So if that's a monster VM, right? Everybody familiar with, and I always throw this out there, but everybody familiar with overhead reservation? Who isn't familiar with overhead reservation? So it's a really important concept because overhead reservation is required on every virtual machine that gets powered on, regardless of whether you've set a reservation or not. So depending on the size of the VM, if you actually read the resource management guide for vSphere, there's a calculator that says based on the size of the VM, it needs this much reservation. So as an example, the easy one is a 32 gig VM. A 32 gig monster VM with 0% reservation actually needs 1 gig of reserved memory to power on. HA admission control won't let it power on if that 1 gig of memory doesn't exist. So that actually means that monster VM needs 33 gigs of memory to run if it's got 100% reservation, right? Because it needs the 100%, which is the 32, plus overhead. Everything is always plus overhead. So you have to remember that. So all this applies, and the difference is in vCloud Director, we're setting this one little number of 100%, and we have to understand what's happening underneath the covers, right? So Frank, the white paper that is coming out that's based on this is 37 pages on this. It's really fun to read, actually. So the next piece of this is how does this actually get distributed in vSphere? So as we can kind of tell, based on the previous, the resource pool has no settings. It's like basically going into vCloud Director or vSphere and creating an empty resource pool, brand new. If you look at the settings, unlimited is checked, expandable reservation is checked. So it's basically allowed to flow, and that's what this means. It flows to the provider. So anybody in your pay-as-you-go model, basically all those individual VMs with all those reservations consume the resources outside of their resource pool at the cluster level, right? So you've got to really monitor that provider. There's really no cap. It's an all-you-can-eat type of model. So it gets pulled directly out of the provider and given to that virtual machine as they come online. So the amount of VMs that you can get in that particular provider, whether it's gold, silver, or bronze, now remember, go back to those models. The first decision was, what kind of performance do you need? Well, I only need 2 gig VMs. Well, okay, we're going to put you on bronze. Well, I need monster VMs. We're going to put you on platinum. So now that very expensive platinum cluster, if you make the mistake or you're not careful about these settings, that monster VM is going to take 32 gigs of RAM right there off the top of that cluster, right? Really expensive hardware, so you got to think about this stuff. So the whole point of this presentation is to get you thinking, right? I like it when people think. So reservation pool does it a little bit differently. So as you can see, it's applied directly at the resource pool level. Nothing gets applied at the VMs. We actually give the consumer control in vCloud Director of those per VM settings in the UI. So they can actually go in and make their own changes. So this is great because how many folks have built like a 3-tier application with a web app database, right? Pretty common. Which VM do you typically want to give more reserved resources to, depending on the application? The database, right? Or if it's a Java application, maybe Java needs some reservation. So in this model, I get my bucket and I could say, oh, I've got all of these VApps. I can fine tune, right? I can literally go in and decide on my own which VMs I want to give more or less to, and then I'm in control of my consolidation ratio within my VDC. So that's where you can actually get some possible overcommitment, because if you set everything at 0, again, same rules apply. You can overcommit within your resource pool. So these are some of the interesting defaults. It's actually set to 20% by default. So whatever the provider has available, vCloud Director automatically takes 20% and applies that. But you can plug any number you want in. You don't have to leave it at that, obviously. And it definitely sets expandable disabled, and it sets a limit on the resource pool. So if you look at the resource pool, there's a reservation and there's a limit, and they're equal, which means it can't flow, right? Not like pay-as-you-go, they can flow out to the provider, to the cluster level. It stays capped. Some of this is changing in the future. Oh, I said the word futures. Keep an eye out for the new release. There is going to be some additions, and we've fought really hard based on this white paper and some of this information to get engineering to change some of their thinking. So allocation pool is a little bit of both. This one gets really wonky, for lack of a better term. What happens is we set all of the settings at the resource pool, and we set memory on a per VM reservation at the VM level. So whatever you set, so the reason this makes it strange is you set the percentage in one field. So you set 100% memory. That 100% of reserved memory gets applied to the resource pool, and that 100% gets applied to every VM. So that's where it gets strange, because you can't control it. So once the provider sets it at 100%, every VM gets deployed at 100%, but the resource pool is also set at 100%. When you lower that number, it gets really strange, because the resource pool gets its reservation based on what's available in the provider. So if my provider's got 50 gig available of memory, and I set that number at 50%, how big is my resource pool going to be? You didn't know there was going to be math involved this morning, did you? 25, right? Because it's going to take that 50%, it's going to apply it to the resource pool, it's going to configure the resource pool at 25%. What it also means is every time a virtual machine goes into that resource pool, it's going to get 50% of its individual memory reserved. So if it's a 32 or let's say a 16 gig VM, 8 gig is going to be reserved from that 25. So you see how as you lower the percentage, it exponentially changes this model? The lowest you can go in this model, and I tried this, is 20%. We will not actually let you configure it lower than 20%, and when you do, you can power on like 2 VMs. Because think of that calculation and how it applies. 20% of, well, let's do 100, right? 20% of 100 is 20 gigs of RAM, and then if you put an 8 gig VM in there, 20% of 8 is 2, right? It's weird being back in a high school. I'm freaking out. So this one you have to really watch out for, right? Because every time you change that number, if you're a service provider, the model that we state is no lower than 75%. So if you're an actual service provider and you want to be a vCloud data center service provider, you can't set this number lower than 75% for that very reason. This is one that's actually getting some adjustment in T2 or 5.1 or whatever the number is going to be. So how does admission control play into this? So this is another great thing to think about when you're architecting and you're talking about cloud. So all this stuff we're talking about is how many VMs you can power on, how much reservation they get. So how many people have ever turned off admission control? Oh, come on, there's more people than that. Raise your hands. So why is that a problem under vCloud Director? So in a regular vSphere environment, why do we do it? We do it because we go to power on the next VM and what happens? No resources available, right? So you go in, you check the box, you power on the next one, and you're supposed to recheck the box. Most people forget to do that part. Carlos and I were on site at a customer for a residency, and they had it turned off for what, about a year? It took 6 nodes to get the cluster back into balance, basically. So why is this important under vCloud Director? Well, with vCloud Director, when you're letting vCloud Director set all of those reservations for you, if you turn that off, your provider VDC gets in jeopardy because you're turning off the traffic cop. You're turning off the ability and the intelligence for it to say no more VMs, right? And if you do that, all of your SLAs go out the window. Because once you start piling on VMs with no control over it, whatever you wrote for an SLA, if it's a performance-based SLA, throw it away. Because you can't meet that. Because even though all the VMs you've given 100% to, they'll still try to power on, but where are they going to get that memory from? They're going to swap. They're going to get it from other places, right? So you'll always be able to power on VMs. You can just keep powering them on without admission control. Admission control works in conjunction with reservations, right? Now, how many people use N+ configurations on their admission control, like N+1, N+2? How many people use percentage-based? Ah, interesting. I won't go into it, but I've actually, I think Frank's written a couple of articles on it. Relook at your configuration. We actually now recommend most people use a percentage-based. Percentage-based doesn't use slot size calculation. It does it differently. The N+1 uses slot size, which is more conservative. So what happens is we had a customer, another customer story, who had pay-as-you-go. So they had the pay-as-you-go model, a big provider cluster. All of the pay-as-you-go stuff was set to 0%, and they were running monster VMs. And they called me up and they said, Chris, why is our cluster falling down? I said, well, explain falling down. And they said, well, it's just maxed. I mean, it's at capacity. I mean, VMs just keep going on it and it keeps, it's just nothing's running well. I said, well, how big are the VMs? They said, well, 32 gigs, 8 gigs, 16 gig. And then they proceeded to tell me that the cluster, the back-end cluster was mixed configuration, which obviously is okay. And I said, well, what do you mean mixed configuration? And they said, well, the hosts have different amounts of memory, physical RAM. I said, okay, so wait a minute. You're telling me you have 32 gig VMs, you have some 16 gig VMs, and you have hosts that have 96 gig and some hosts that have 192. I said, the hosts that have 96 can only support so many VMs because each one of those needs a 1 gig reservation to power on, where the other host can support more. I said, but explain to me one thing. I said, how are you continuing to add things? How is it powering on? I said, oh, well, we disabled admission control. I hung up the phone. Kind of. I put it on mute and I went, and I got back on the phone and I said, turn it back on. And they said, well, it was too conservative. I said, use percentage. Don't use slot size calculation. So, and I said, oh, and by the way, take those clusters you built, the ones that have 96 and the ones that have 192, and go back to my first slide and build 2 providers. And put the monster VMs on the bigger hosts so that they can properly support the memory reservations that those need to power on and run. And so they kind of started getting it, right? It's all about, none of this was anything about vCloud Director. We were just talking about actual old school vSphere knowledge, right? What's happened over the year or 2 years is that I think people have seen the simplicity of vCloud Director but forgot all of the ways things work under the covers. I'm still a big nuts and bolts kind of guy. I like to get under there and see what's going on. And so is Frank. So this is why this was fun to write. So this is a little graphical representation of something I drew for the customer on the whiteboard the other day. And I said, well, we've got our bronze, silver, and gold. But what's interesting is the way these are mapped, right? So this down here is the customer's perception of which is better, right? So although this is the provider's bronze, silver, and gold hardware tiers, this is pay-as-you-go, and this is pay-as-you-go, but this one's at 100% reservation, this one's at 0. So even though this one is technically mapped to the silver hardware, to the customer, this is actually the best performing because they're getting the highest level of reservation that they can get automatically. They don't have to think about it. They deploy a VM, it gets 100%. They deploy a VM, it gets 100%, right? This one is sort of their silver tier because they're not doing any per VM settings. So maybe the customer's got their bucket, but they're not going in and setting those. So in my opinion, if somebody gives a reservation pool to a customer and that customer's not going to set the per VM settings, don't give them the reservation pool. Because all they're going to do is deploy from template and everything's going to just pick up whatever the template was configured for. So they're not going to maximize the use of that model. So just a little bit of review as to how this stuff relates to vSphere. So these are the things you got to remember, and I apologize for turning my back, I just can't see the laptop screen. We have to remember that vSphere always owns the resource distribution, right? It's always going to own the resource distribution. So I have 2 rules now. In February I had 1 rule. What was that? Don't disable DRS, and now I have a 2nd rule. Don't disable HA, right? When you're running vCloud Director, those 2 things are key to this infrastructure so that it runs properly. If you don't turn off the stuff that we've engineered, you won't violate constraints. You won't get yourself in trouble. You won't shoot yourself in the foot. The people that go in and start going, I can do this better than VMware engineers, and start making changes, that's when bad stuff happens, right? We have a lot of really smart people in Palo Alto. I'm not one of them, but we have a lot of them out there, and they've done a really good job of making this stuff just work. So don't forget about this. There's this thing called the system VDC, and the reason this one's interesting is it's a resource pool that's created when you build your first vCloud Director instance, and the only thing that goes into that resource pool is your organization network vShield edge devices, right? They're little tiny VMs. Now, that resource pool is just like pay-as-you-go. It can flow, right? It has no limits on it, it has no reservations. Most people think this isn't a big deal because the configuration of every edge device is 64 megahertz of reservation CPU and 64 megabytes of reserved memory. Doesn't sound like a lot. Multiply it by 250, because in a large provider who's running a lot of consumer organizations in the same vSphere environment, that number now becomes almost 16 gigs of reservation. So it's something you have to consider as the provider, right? The consumer doesn't know about it, but on the provider VDC, and which provider VDC is it running on? Is it running on the gold, the silver, the bronze? Is it spread out? The way we place those is a little strange right now, so I think that's changing. We actually place it based on the network connectivity that's available, so if all 3 tiers have the same network connectivity, it's a crapshoot which one is going to get the vShield Edge running. So in theory, you could get your vShield Edges running on your Platinum tier with SSD storage. You can always move them after the fact, but don't forget about the overhead, right? I always bring this up. I bring this up with every customer now from working with Frank on this because even I forgot about it, you know. Some of us do this so long that we just forget some of the basics, and he reminded me, and we did, you know, we started talking about monster VMs and started talking about running monster VMs inside vCloud Director. We were like, whoa, wait a minute, this changes everything, right? Oops. So understand how it controls everything. You know, not to plug my friend in their books, but this is all really well covered in the DRS HA deep dive book that Frank and Duncan wrote, specifically chapter 13, which is Frank's chapter, or one of Frank's chapters. When we started doing this white paper, I literally opened the book and like started highlighting everything in this chapter because it's still valid and it's really good information. So some design considerations from VCAT 2.0, 2.1, soon to be 3.0 at VMworld. Don't map your provider VDCs to a resource pool. Map them to the cluster. So all these things that I've been having you think about, right? All this resource control and all the stuff that happens. So I've been doing that under the assumption that I've pointed my provider VDC to a cluster level. Now, if I point that to a resource pool level, that I can manually make changes on. All rules still apply, but now what happens if somebody goes in and changes that resource pool, that parent resource pool? It starts to flow down through all that stuff that we just talked about. So don't get into that sibling rivalry issue, just map it to a cluster. So those 3 blocks that I put up there initially with gold, silver, bronze, platinum, those would ideally be separate clusters, right? Because they're separate hardware, they're separate configurations, they support separate storage. They might even support separate networks. So these are just some of the things that affect the allocation models differently. You want to remember where things are set, that in one it's set on the VMs, and one it's set on resource pools, and the third it's set on both, right? So it's a little bit of a hybrid. This is actually changing. I always point out the 0.26 gigahertz because everybody yells at us for it. I believe in the next release they finally changed it to 1 gigahertz at least. So this was a problem for a lot of people that were deploying and just doing POCs and using the defaults, right? You got 260 megahertz of CPU that was capped and 100% memory reservation. That's kind of a strange VM, right? That VM doesn't really run well. It's got a whole bunch of reserved memory but no CPU because there's a limit on it. Oops. All right, so how do we actually define some of these service offerings? So as I've taken you through this, hopefully you're thinking about why this is so multidimensional, right? Because you're dealing with the provider end of it, then you're dealing with the next layer of it, and then you're coming down into what about our availability? So is availability a service? Or as I like to call it, AaaS. Availability is a service. This is new. This isn't out there. I just made it up. But it was an interesting question. Somebody asked me this. They said, should I have an expectation of availability by default? Because if everything behind, Carlos is killing himself back there. If I know that everything back-ending all of my cloud is vSphere, right? And I assume, there's a big assumption that the provider is using vSphere the way they're supposed to. They have HA enabled. They're running multiple clusters. Should I have to worry about availability of the infrastructure? Should that, for me, the consumer, be something that's already taken care of, or does that have to be written into the SLA? What about availability of my VMs? Everybody remembers the AWS issue a couple of years ago, right? Where consumers put stuff all in the same AWS instance, the same Amazon instance. They didn't separate their application from instance 1 or instance 2, right? I've got a service provider that's a vCloud provider, and they've got one vCloud portal, but they have a data center, they have a cloud in Virginia and a cloud in LA. Now, isn't it my responsibility to make sure that I deploy my application, separated between those two, or is that their responsibility? They've provided me the 2 data centers to use, but it's my application at the end of the day. So where is the line in availability, and where does it become a service? I believe it definitely at the provider level, network availability, storage redundancy, those things are are part of the SLA because that's what's being given to me. I can't control that. But I don't really see where people are going to put that, they assume they have that availability, but I don't see where most consumers, and I've heard this, online where they say, well, my application went down. Well, it was all in the same data center. What did you expect? You didn't load balance it. You didn't separate it. Well, I thought you were going to do that. No, we gave you all of the back end, but we don't run your application. We don't manage your application for you. So something else to think about. And maybe gold and platinum actually add some DR functionality by the provider, right? So we wrote, myself and a couple other folks wrote the white paper and the PSO offering for doing SRM with vCloud Director at the infrastructure level, right? So maybe the provider says, okay, if you're on platinum or gold, we've implemented that solution, so we can actually now add another level of service for those data centers or for those tiers because we've implemented actual disaster recovery with SRM on the infrastructure that's running vCloud Director. And maybe they cover the VMs, maybe something else covers the VMs, we don't know, but at least they could say the infrastructure, the cloud will be up in another site. In lower tiers, obviously, you would assume a lower level of service, hopefully. So what makes up the service catalog, right? There's another layer of the onion. So what are we providing in the catalog? So what is the consumer going to be able to go and get, right? Are we providing just base operating systems? Are we providing applications? I can't really talk about a lot of it, but there is something coming in the next month or so that will have some of this make sense, where you'll see what some people are putting in catalogs. And it's varying, right? There's applications. There's a couple companies out there that write, Turnkey's one of them, they write appliances, right? So a service provider could put that appliance into their catalog and give that to you as a consumer to deploy, right? It's basically open source. Do they put Linux in there? Do they put Windows in there? They have to license the Windows stuff, right? So what is in that catalog? It can be any one of these things, but these are the things you have to consider. So from an infrastructure as a service perspective, it's usually not applications. It's usually your operating systems, your base OS, your CentOS, Red Hat, Windows 2003, maybe some of those other things. When we get down into platform as a service, or even software as a service, you're starting to look at pre-built appliances, right? What if that provider is giving you access to a MySQL box? So it's not just a Linux shell, but it's the Linux shell with MySQL installed and configured when you deploy it, right? With a default username, default password, and then you can customize it as you want. Saves you time, right? You don't have to do that install, but if it's all based on that distribution, you can patch it, you can do everything you need to do. But that's part of the service offering, right? Whatever, if there's nothing in the catalog, so if you go to a service provider that has an empty catalog, and you have to do everything, you've got to upload your ISO images, you've got to build all your VMs from scratch, are you really getting a good service? Right? We get what we pay for, and what we pay for, there should be some stuff in the catalog. So, and this is really key. So I get this question all the time, and I'm not sure if any of the guys are in the room that I had this conversation with a couple weeks ago. I always get the question, well, what is everybody else doing? What are their use cases? What's the use case for somebody in my industry? And I look at them and I say, what does it matter? And they look at me like a deer in the headlights and they say, well, because we want to know what other people are doing. I said, if other people are jumping off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? What are your use cases? What are the use cases that you want to focus on? And they start to think about it and they say, well, what do you mean? And we start talking through it. And I say, well, do you do internal development? Do you have developers on site that need to check out VMs and do application testing? Do you have system administrators that want to bang on a new piece of software because it's the latest, greatest, shiny thing, but they don't have a VM to do it on? Or you want them to eval something else, right, for your organization? And they start to say, oh, well, yeah, we have that. I said, okay, then that's your use case, right? Those are the things you can use cloud for. These are just some of them, right? I mean, this was a big one. When I was a system admin, I mean, I had to go, this was back in, 2004? I had to go beg, borrow, and steal to find a box to put an operating system on so I could test like a new version of an existing piece of software we already had. If I could go to a requisition form and request a VM and have it in 5 minutes and know I could have it for 30 days to test that application, how sweet is that? Right? That's a valid use case. That's a huge use case, and everybody in the enterprise space that's looking at cloud, they always say, well, yeah, we see cloud for a service provider. That's the biggest one, right? Your system admins that you want to give them VMs to work with. We are seeing production, so we're seeing some level of production, pre-production. We're seeing people put, not Exchange yet, but certainly web servers and other stuff out in Cloud Director. They're just not putting leases on them, right? The lease just doesn't expire, so it's permanent. Different use cases are going to have different service levels, right? Your developers or your system admins. So if we're all system admins, do we expect that our stuff that we're beating and banging on is going to have DR? Probably not. When we were doing it before, the box under our desk didn't have DR, right? We found a desktop when we threw Windows 2000 server on it and we started loading stuff up. If the power went out, and oh well, right? So that's a situation where those developers or those system admins would be in that bronze tier, that silver tier, right? If they're not doing something that's important. These use cases are always going to constantly evolve. So we're seeing cloud grow, right? We're seeing why it grows because of the self-service piece and people actually building more of it. And stay flexible to be flexible. So what that means is, go back to my original comment around how a lot of service providers have built their offerings around one template. Right? Everybody gets the same org VDC with the same configuration, and it's like it's the Mac commercial, the old Apple commercial all over again. We don't have to do that. Everybody can be different. So keep the cloud flexible. Use what's in it to do all these different things. You can have, technically, two reservation pool models with two different configurations on the same hardware tier, right? They can both live on silver, but customer A and customer B are just going to have a different bucket of resources. It just affects the cluster differently. I think most providers are doing it because it's easy to try to predict what the capacity planning is going to be. Forget that. Don't be easy. Easy is not fun, right? Be creative and be flexible because you can offer more to your customers, right? If I want to be able to go, so I have a space at a service provider, and I figured out what their pay-as-you-go configuration was based on what my testing was. I said, I need 2 gigahertz CPUs on because they set the limit at 1 gigahertz for pay-as-you-go, and they said, well, that's not our template. I said, I don't care, you're asking me to do stuff for you. give me 2 gigahertz. It's my own organization. What does it matter? I said, it's not going to affect anybody else. And they went, oh, right. They kind of completely forgot, right, that you don't have to have everybody be equal. Everybody can be different. We're all different, right? I'm very different. And last thing is definitely stay plugged in. There's going to be some new stuff coming. I'm pre-writing a blog article for this release in early August, hopefully, if it goes through. So that'll go into a public beta, I think, if it stays on time. So it'll be kind of cool for some of this stuff. So I'm actually taking screenshots now and working on it. So with that, hopefully, like I said, this was ground up presentation, just a lot of cool thoughts from customers that I've talked to, and hopefully this had no speeds and feeds other than the allocation model stuff, but I wanted to make it something that you guys walk away from as customers and as partners and say, okay, I'm going to go build my cloud. Now am I armed with a little more thought around how I'm going to do this, right? And how do I have to sit down and work through the decisions and the offerings and things like that? Because in January, we talked about vCloud Director, and we went right into vCloud Director, and we dove right into it, and I found out afterwards that I think like 5 people in the room were running it. Or something. So Chris asked me to spin this a little differently because this is more of a baseline, right? Before you install vCloud Director, you have to think about what is my service catalog and what are my service offerings and what is my SLAs going to look like. So we can take questions. We've got a couple minutes since we started a couple minutes late, so you'll have to yell them out because this thing isn't really going to reach very far. So, and then the room, who's got the cricket noise? Tommy. That's a loaded question, my friend. Do I see it? Yeah, sorry. So the question was, do I see vCloud Director replacing vSphere? The answer would be no. In a sense, vSphere is the underlying engine, right? So it's always doing the resource management. What I believe you'll see, and I don't know for sure, but you'll start to see a little more of a convergence of the 2 separate products, right? Where what vCloud Director does versus what vSphere does. So I look at it like vSphere is the engine and vCloud Director is more like the transmission, right? I mean, they have 2 completely separate jobs, but we're actually trying to bring those together a little bit in engineering because it is hard to have 2 UIs that basically where one UI is issuing commands to the other that you could do, some people argue you could do manually, but you don't do them as clean, right? You can't set percentages in vSphere. So stay tuned. Definitely there's going to be some stuff happening probably the next couple of years just to bring those a little closer together. But the functionality that you know and love around resource scheduling, that's not going away. That'll always be there. Question? None? Wow, I must have done a really good job. And then Chris is back. Did you want to introduce the next speaker? Or?
Sure. Is everyone done?
Yeah, is there no more questions? If there's any more questions, we'll take them. But no? All right, golf clap. Thank you.